Hello, dear listener. Welcome back to the Sleep Wizards Library. I'm Emma Brooks, and tonight I invite you to slow down with me. Wherever you're listening from, in your bed, on a quiet night shift, or beneath a soft blanket with the rain tapping against your window, you're safe here. Before we begin, take a moment to settle in. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breath slow. And if you're wearing headphones, let the sound of my breathing rest gently in your ears, as if someone is keeping watch while you drift towards sleep. Tonight's story is a dark medieval fantasy, a tale of love, sacrifice, war, separation, and the quiet kind of reunion that only comes after everything has been tested. If this story brings you comfort, don't forget to support the channel. A simple like helps this library reach other wandering souls who need rest. And if you feel like it, tell us in the comments where you're listening from. Those of us who love these stories are always curious to know. Now, close your eyes, breathe slowly, and let the world fall away. A love forged in silence. There was a kingdom once in the forgotten corners of the world where the mountains met the mist and the forest grew so thick that sunlight rarely touched the ground. It had no name that travelers remembered. It existed in the space between legends, whispered about in taverns by old men who claimed their grandfathers had seen its towers, black against storm clouds rising from stone that predated memory itself. The kingdom stood where the forest ended and the stone began. It was not a realm of songs or splendor. It had been built by hands that knew cold, raised by men who had learned to survive the silence of winter and the whispers that came with fog. The towers rose gray against grayer skies, and the banners that hung from their walls bore no bright colors, only the faded sigil of a tree split by lightning, embroidered in ash and iron thread. This was a place that wore its history like a scar. Every stone remembered blood. Every corridor held the echo of footsteps long since turned to dust. The wind that blew through the battlements carried voices from a time when the world was younger and crueler, when men fought not for glory but for survival, and the land drank their sacrifice without gratitude. Rain fell often here. It softened the edges of things, blurred the boundaries between earth and sky, made the world feel older than it was. It fell in sheets against the castle walls, ran in rivers through the courtyards, filled the wells and the moats until everything smelled of wet stone and iron and earth. In the great hall, fires burned low, candles flickered in iron sconces, their flames dancing like captured souls. The stone walls held the memory of 100 winters, and the silence between the stones was heavy with waiting. The kind of waiting that has no end, only endurance. This was a kingdom that had forgotten how to hope. But once, long before the wars came, it had known something gentler. Once, there had been laughter in these halls. Once, children had run through these corridors without fear. Once, the people who lived here had believed that tomorrow might be better than today. That time had passed. Now, the kingdom simply endured. It survived. It drew breath and watched the seasons turn and waited for whatever ending the world had planned for it. And in this kingdom, in the highest tower of the eastern wing, there lived a princess who had learned to wait as well. She was the second daughter, and so she had been spared the weight of the crown but not the burden of its shadow. Her name was Elira, though few spoke it aloud. She was called Princess, or My Lady, or nothing at all. She had learned early that her life was not her own, that she was a piece to be moved across a board she could not see, a promise to be kept or broken, depending on the needs of men who spoke in low voices behind closed doors. She did not resent this. Resentment required a kind of fire she had never been taught to tend. Her tutors had taught her letters and numbers, history and geography, the names of herbs and the movements of stars. But they had never taught her how to want things for herself, how to demand, how to refuse. So she had become quiet instead, observant, patient in the way that stones are patient. She spent her days in the high tower room that overlooked the eastern woods, reading books her tutors had long abandoned, tracing maps of places she would never visit, listening to the rain drum against ancient glass. The room was hers at least. That much had been granted. It was circular, with windows on 3 sides and a narrow bed pushed against the wall. There was a desk, scarred and ink-stained, where she wrote letters she never sent. There was a chair by the window where she sat for hours, watching the light change over the trees, watching the crows gather and disperse, watching the world turn without her. She wore gray often. It suited her, they said. It matched the stone. It matched her eyes, which were pale and clear and gave nothing away. Her sister, the elder, had married a prince from the southern provinces 3 years ago. There had been a wedding of silk and silver, of trumpets and feasting and promises spoken before 1,000 witnesses, and then she had gone away, carried off in a procession of horses and banners and armed men, and Alira had watched from the battlements as the column disappeared into the mist. She had not wept. She had only stood there, her hands folded against the cold stone, her face still as winter water, until the last banner vanished and the road was empty again, and there was nothing left to see. That was the year the night came. He had no name that mattered. He was called Theron, which meant hunter in the old tongue, and he had been given to the service of the crown when he was still a boy of 12, too young to understand what he was surrendering, too old to be forgiven for not knowing. His father had been a soldier who died in a border skirmish no one remembered. His mother, a seamstress in the lower city, had succumbed to fever the winter after. Neither had lived long enough to see him take his vows, to see him kneel before the king and swear his life to a cause he did not fully understand. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with dark hair that fell across his eyes when he forgot to tie it back. His face was hard in the way that faces become when they have seen too much too soon. But there was a gentleness in his hands, a carefulness in the way he moved, as if he understood that strength was a responsibility, not a right. He did not speak often. Words, he had learned, were dangerous things. They could be twisted, used against you, turned into weapons sharper than any blade. So he kept his thoughts to himself, offered only what was required, and let his silence speak for him. He had been assigned to the princess's guard after the former captain fell ill and died of something the physicians could not name. It was not an honor. It was simply a duty, another task in a long line of tasks, and duties were what he understood. So he stood outside her door at night, his back against the stone, his hand never far from his sword. He walked 3 paces behind her in the corridors, his footsteps soft, his presence steady. He watched the shadows in the courtyard while she sat beneath the oak tree, reading books whose titles he could not see. She did not acknowledge him, and he did not expect her to. For a long time, that was all there was. Days became weeks. Weeks became months. The seasons turned. He stood guard. She lived her quiet life. They existed in the same space without touching, without speaking, like 2 planets orbiting the same sun, held in place by forces neither could name. The first time she spoke to him, it was raining. It was always raining in this kingdom, but that day the rain fell harder than usual, as if the sky itself were mourning something it could not remember. She had gone to the chapel at dusk, as she sometimes did, to light a candle for her mother, who had died when Alira was still a child of 7. The chapel was small, tucked into the northern wing of the castle where few people ventured, and it smelled of old wood and wax and the faint sweetness of herbs that had been hung from the rafters to ward off rot and evil spirits alike. The chapel was older than the castle itself, built in a time when men still believed that prayers could change the shape of the world. Its walls were thick, its windows narrow, and its altar carved from a single piece of black stone that gleamed like frozen water. Theron had followed her, as always, his footsteps silent on the worn flagstones, and taken his place by the door. He did not pray. He had stopped praying years ago after he realized that the gods, if they existed at all, had no interest in the small griefs of men. The rain grew heavier. It drummed against the roof like 1,000 urgent fingers, ran in rivers down the narrow windows, turned the world outside into a blur of gray and green and shadow. The candle she had lit flickered in the draft, but did not go out. She knelt there for a long time, her hands folded, her head bowed, her lips moving in words he could not hear. When she finally rose, she turned and saw him standing in the shadows, his cloak damp and heavy, his face unreadable in the dim light. "You must be cold," she said. It was the first time she had spoken to him directly. Her voice was softer than he had expected, gentler. It carried no command, no expectation, only a simple observation, as if she had noticed something about the world and felt compelled to mention it. He did not move. "I am fine, my lady." "There is a fire in the hall," she said quietly, her eyes steady on his. "You need not stand in the rain for my sake." "I stand where you are, my lady." She looked at him for a moment, and something in her expression shifted, something too subtle to name, a softening at the edges, a recognition of something shared. "Then I will not stay long," she said. And she did not, but as she passed him on her way out, she paused just for a breath, close enough that he could smell the faint scent of lavender that clung to her hair, and said, "Thank you." He did not know what she was thanking him for, but he inclined his head and watched her go, and felt something shift inside him that he did not have words for, something ancient and inevitable, like the first crack in ice at the end of winter. The weeks passed like water through stone, slow, persistent, shaping things without sound. She began to notice him, not as a guard, not as a figure in the background, but as a presence. She noticed the way he moved through space with absolute certainty, never wasting motion, never second-guessing. She noticed the way his gaze swept rooms without lingering, without judgment, cataloging threats and exits with the efficiency of someone who had learned to survive in places where mistakes were fatal. She noticed that he never spoke unless spoken to, and that when he did, his words were deliberate, chosen carefully, as if language were a blade he had been taught to wield with precision and respect. She noticed that he was kind to the servants, that he stepped aside in narrow corridors to let them pass, that he learned their names when no one else bothered. She noticed that he broke his own bread to share with the dogs in the courtyard, that he spoke to them softly in a language that was half words and half something older. She noticed that he polished his sword every night by the light of a single candle, his movements slow and meditative, as if the act itself were a prayer or a remembrance or both. She did not know why she noticed these things, but she did. And he in turn began to see her, not as the princess, not as the daughter of the king, but as a woman who carried her loneliness the way he carried his sword, close to the body, hidden beneath layers, never acknowledged but always present. He saw the way she stood at the window in the mornings, watching the light change over the forest, her face unguarded in those early moments before the day demanded its mask. He saw the way she touched the spines of books as if they were old friends returning from long journeys. He saw the way she folded her hands when she was thinking, the way she tilted her head when she listened, really listened, in a way that made people feel heard. He saw the way she smiled, so rarely, but when she did, it transformed her face, made her beautiful in a way that had nothing to do with features and everything to do with light breaking through stone. He saw her and he said nothing, because what was there to say? He was a knight, she was a princess. The distance between them was not measured in paces, but in birth, in duty, in the immutable laws that governed their world. So he kept his distance and did his duty and told himself that this was enough. Winter came with its usual cruelty. The kingdom grew colder. The fires in the great hall burned day and night, and still the stone walls wept with frost, as if the castle itself were crying. The snow fell in silence, covering the courtyard, the battlements, the graves beyond the walls where the kingdom buried its dead without ceremony. The servants moved through the corridors like ghosts, wrapped in layers of wool, their breath misting in the frozen air. The dogs huddled together for warmth. The guards stamped their feet and blew on their hands and counted the hours until their watch ended. Elira spent more time in the tower. The cold did not bother her as much as the darkness, the way the sun seemed to give up early each day, surrendering to night without a fight. She read less. The words seemed to blur on the page, meaningless. Instead, she sat by the window and watched the world turn white, watched the snow erase the boundaries between things, making everything uniform and still. Theron stood outside her door, as always, wrapped in a thick cloak, his sword at his side. One night she could not sleep. The insomnia had been coming more frequently, a restlessness that made her skin feel too tight, as if her body knew something her mind refused to acknowledge. She lay in bed for hours, listening to the wind howl around the tower, feeling the cold seep through the stone, and finally gave up. She rose and wrapped herself in a thick cloak lined with fur and stepped into the corridor. Theron straightened at once, his hand moving instinctively to the hilt of his sword, his body shifting into readiness. "My lady." "I need air," she said quietly. "Walk with me." He hesitated for just a moment, weighing duty against protocol, then nodded. They descended the spiral staircase in silence, their footsteps echoing softly against the stone. The castle was quiet. Most of the household had gone to bed hours ago. Only the night guards remained, stationed at their posts, and they nodded as the princess and her guard passed, but said nothing. She led him to the eastern courtyard, where the old oak tree stood, its branches bare and black against the snow-covered ground. The sky was clear for once, swept clean by the wind, and the stars were bright, cold, innumerable, so many that they seemed to blur together into a river of light. She stopped beneath the tree and looked up, her breath misting in the frozen air. "My mother used to bring me here," she said after a long moment, "when I was small, before she died." Theron said nothing. He stood a few paces behind her, his breath misting in the cold, his hands loose at his sides. "She said the oak was older than the castle," Elira continued, her voice soft, almost dreamlike. "Older than the kingdom. She said it remembered things we had forgotten, wars and winters and the names of people who turned to dust 1,000 years ago." He considered this. "I believe the world is older than we know, and wiser." She turned to look at him then, her face pale in the starlight, her eyes searching his. "You speak like a scholar," she said, and there was no mockery in her tone, only genuine curiosity. "I was taught to read," he said, "before I was taught to fight, before I knew that fighting was what my life would become." "By whom?" "A priest, in the lower city, Father Aldrich. He was old even then, nearly blind, but he insisted that every boy in his care learn their letters. He said a man who could read could never be truly alone, that books were companions that never aged, never betrayed, never asked for anything but attention." She smiled just slightly. He was right. Yes, he was. They stood there in the cold, the silence stretching between them like a thread, fragile but unbroken. "I am alone often," she said finally, so quietly he almost did not hear her. "I know," he said, and she looked at him, really looked at him, and something in her eyes broke open, just for a moment, before she closed it again with visible effort. "We should go inside," she said, her voice suddenly formal again. "Yes, my lady." But neither of them moved. Not yet. The stars wheeled overhead. The wind whispered through the oak's bare branches, and two people stood in the snow, close enough to touch but worlds apart, bound by rules they had not made and could not break. Finally, she gathered herself and turned toward the castle. He followed as always, 3 paces behind. The king fell ill in the spring. It was not sudden. He had been failing for years, growing weaker, thinner, his body slowly surrendering to time and grief and the weight of a crown that had never fit quite right. His mind drifted in and out like tide, some days sharp and present, other days lost in memories of a wife long dead and wars long ended. But now the illness took hold in earnest, and the physicians gathered in his chambers with their herbs and their leeches and their whispered prayers to gods who seemed increasingly distant. Elira was summoned. She sat by his bedside for hours, holding his hand, which had become little more than bone wrapped in papery skin. He did not recognize her most of the time. He called her by her mother's name and wept, and asked her to forgive him for things she did not understand, old sins, old regrets, the accumulated weight of a life spent making choices that benefited kingdoms but destroyed people. She stayed until he slept, which he did only fitfully, his breath rattling in his chest like dice in a cup. When she emerged from the chamber, dawn was breaking. The corridor was empty except for Theron, who stood waiting, his face grave. She did not speak. She walked past him, her face blank, her hands trembling slightly at her sides. He followed her to her room, and when she reached the door, she stopped. "I do not want to be alone tonight," she said, and her voice was small, younger than he had ever heard it. He went very still. "My lady." "Sit outside my door," she said quickly, as if afraid he might misunderstand. "Just Stay close, please. I will. She nodded, not looking at him, and went inside and closed the door. He sat with his back against the wall, his sword across his knees, and listened to the sound of her weeping through the wood. It was a terrible sound. Broken, raw, all the grief she had been holding back for years, finally finding voice in the darkness. He did not move until morning, until the sun rose and her weeping stopped and the castle began to stir with the business of the day. Only then did he stand, stiff and aching, and resume his post. The king died 3 days later. The bells rang across the kingdom, a mournful tolling that echoed from tower to tower, village to village, until even the farthest reaches of the realm knew that the crown had passed from one head to another, from father to child, from one generation's failures to the next generation's burdens. Black banners were raised. The great hall filled with nobles and priests and soldiers, all of them dressed in mourning, all of them speaking in hushed voices about succession and alliances and the threat of war from the northern clans who had been gathering like storm clouds on the border. Illyra's sister returned from the south, her belly swollen with child, her husband at her side, a tall man with a soldier's bearing and a politician's smile. She wept openly at the funeral, clutching her husband's arm, her grief loud and visible for all to witness. Illyra did not weep. She stood beside the grave, her face pale and still as marble, her hands folded. She spoke the words she was meant to speak, the ancient prayers that had been spoken over the dead for 1,000 years. She placed the white rose on the stone. She turned and walked back to the castle without looking back, without acknowledging the crowd that had gathered to watch. Theron walked behind her, as always, his presence a quiet constant in a world that seemed to be falling apart. That night the council met. Illyra was not invited. She stood in the corridor outside the chamber, listening to the muffled voices within, catching fragments of conversation through the heavy door. She heard her name. She heard the word marriage spoken like a solution to a problem, like a treaty to be negotiated. She heard her sister's husband speaking of alliances, of necessity, of the good of the realm. She heard the counselors agreeing, their voices low and serious, making plans for her life without her presence, without her consent. When the doors finally opened, the counselors filed out, their faces grave. One of them, an old man with a silver chain around his neck and eyes like winter, paused when he saw her standing there. "My lady," he said, inclining his head with practiced courtesy, "we will speak with you in the morning." She said nothing. He walked away, his footsteps echoing down the corridor, and the others followed, leaving her alone. Theron stepped closer, his presence solid, grounding. "My lady." "They are going to marry me off," she said. Her voice was flat, distant, as if she were speaking from very far away. "To some lord I have never met, for the good of the kingdom." He did not deny it. There was no point. "When?" she asked. "I do not know." She looked at him then, and for the first time, he saw something wild in her eyes, something desperate and caged and barely contained. "I do not want this," she said. "I know. I want—" She stopped. She closed her eyes. She breathed, deep and shaking. "What do you want, my lady?" he asked, so quietly it was almost not a question. She opened her eyes and looked at him, and he saw everything in that look. Everything she could not say, everything she had been holding back, everything that would break her if she let it free. "It does not matter," she said finally. And she turned and walked away, leaving him standing in the empty corridor, his heart a stone in his chest. The war came before the wedding could be arranged. The northern clans had been gathering for months, amassing forces in the mountains, and now they moved south like a flood, burning villages, taking land, killing anyone who resisted. The king's death had left the kingdom weak, divided, leaderless, and the clans had sensed it like wolves scenting blood on the wind. The council called for soldiers. Banners were raised in every province. The young men of the kingdom gathered in courtyards and market squares, taking up swords and spears, swearing oaths they did not fully understand to defend a realm that had given them little but hardship and hunger. Theron was among them. He had no choice. He was a knight, sworn to the crown, and the crown needed him now more than it ever had. Duty called, and duty was all he had ever known. Elira found him in the armory, strapping on his breastplate, his movements efficient and practiced. His face was hard, closed, the face of a man preparing himself for death. "You are leaving," she said. It was not a question. "Yes." "When?" "At dawn." She stood very still, her hands folded, her face carefully blank. "You may not come back." "No." She looked at him, and he looked at her, and the space between them felt like a chasm too wide to cross, too deep to measure. "I would ask you to stay," she said, "but I have no right." "You have every right," he said quietly. "Then stay." He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were full of pain. "I cannot." "Why?" "Because if I do, I will have betrayed everything I am, everything I have sworn, and you would not love a man who could do that." She flinched as if he had struck her. "I never said I loved you," she whispered. "No," he said, "you never did." He picked up his sword and buckled it to his side. His hands were steady, practiced, moving through motions they had performed 1,000 times. "If you come back," she began. "I will not expect anything," he said, cutting her off gently. "I know what you are. I know what I am. I know the distance between us." "That is not what I meant." "Then what did you mean?" She looked at him, and her eyes were bright with unshed tears, and her voice broke when she spoke. "I meant that if you come back, I will be here, no matter what they do, no matter who they marry me to, no matter how much time passes, I will be here." He stared at her, and something in his chest cracked open. "My lady!" "I will be here," she said again, fiercely, desperately. "Do you understand? I will wait." He crossed the space between them in 2 strides and took her hands in his. His grip was strong, warm, certain. The first time he had ever touched her deliberately, the first time he had allowed himself to close the distance. "Then I will come back," he said. "I swear it." And he kissed her hands once, gently, his lips warm against her skin. Then he let her go and walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty armory, leaving her standing alone with tears streaming down her face. He left at dawn, as promised. The column of soldiers gathered in the courtyard as the sun rose over the eastern woods. They were young, most of them, barely more than boys, but they wore armor and carried weapons, and spoke with the false bravado of men who had never seen death up close. Theron stood among them, his face grim, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. Elira watched from the battlements, wrapped in her cloak, her face pale in the early light. She did not call out. She did not wave. She simply stood there, her hands gripping the cold stone, and watched as the column marched through the gates and disappeared into the mist that blanketed the valley. She stood there long after they were gone, long after the last horse had vanished and the last banner had faded into gray, until the sun was high and the mist had burned away, and there was nothing left to see but empty road. Only then did she turn and walk back into the castle and close the door behind her. Months passed like years. The war dragged on, a grinding, brutal thing that consumed men and resources and left nothing but ash in its wake. News came in fragments, reports of battles won and lost, villages burned, men dead. The numbers grew until they stopped meaning anything, until death became just another statistic in a ledger. The council met in secret, their faces grave, their voices low. The nobles argued about strategy, about alliances, about when to sue for peace and when to commit more soldiers to a war that seemed to have no end. Elira's sister gave birth to a son. The bells rang and the kingdom pretended to celebrate, but the joy felt hollow, forced, like a play performed for an audience that had already left. Elira waited. She took her meals in silence, barely touching the food. She walked the corridors at night, unable to sleep, haunted by thoughts she could not name. She stood at the window and watched the forest, listening for the sound of hooves, the clatter of armor, the voice she would know anywhere. But there was only silence. And then, one day in late autumn, a messenger arrived. He was bloodied, exhausted, his horse nearly dead beneath him. He carried a sealed letter from the front, stained with mud and what looked like dried blood. The council opened it in the great hall while Elira waited outside, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might break through her ribs. Finally, the doors opened and she was summoned. She entered the chamber slowly, each step an act of will. "My lady," the chief counselor said, his voice carefully neutral. "There has been a battle, a great one. The northern clans have been pushed back across the border." "And our soldiers?" she asked, her voice steady despite the roaring in her ears. "Many have fallen." "How many?" "Too many to count. The losses were significant." She felt the floor shift beneath her, but she kept her face still. "Do we have names?" The counselor hesitated, exchanging glances with his fellows. "Some. The captain is compiling a list. It will take time." "I want to see it." "My lady." "I want to see it now." He sighed and nodded slowly, then handed her a parchment, rolled and sealed. She took it with hands that did not shake, could not shake, because if they did, she would shatter completely. She broke the seal and unrolled it. The list was long, so many names written in hasty script, some smudged, some barely legible. She scanned them once, her eyes moving quickly down the page. Then again, more slowly, her heart sinking with each line. And there it was, halfway down the second column. Theron, Knight, Fallen. The parchment slipped from her fingers and drifted to the floor like a dead leaf. "My lady," the counselor said, his voice distant as if coming from underwater. She did not answer. She turned and walked out of the chamber, her steps slow and mechanical, her face blank. She climbed the stairs to her tower, one hand trailing along the wall for balance. She reached her room, entered, and closed the door behind her. And then, alone, she broke. She collapsed to the floor and wept, great racking sobs that tore through her like violence, all the grief and fear and loneliness she had been holding back for months, finally finding release. She wept until she had no tears left, until her throat was raw and her eyes burned and her chest ached with the effort of breathing. And when she was done, she lay on the cold stone floor and stared at nothing and felt the world go gray and flat and empty. They told her she must marry. The war had depleted the kingdom's resources. The treasury was nearly empty. Fields had been burned, villages destroyed, trade routes disrupted. The realm needed alliances, needed gold, needed stability. A lord from the western reaches had made an offer: land, gold, soldiers. He was older, twice widowed, but he was powerful, and the council had decided. She listened to them explain. She nodded. She did not argue. What was the point? The wedding was set for the first day of autumn, after the harvest, when the roads would be clear and the weather mild enough for travel. She went through the preparations like a sleepwalker, moving through the world without touching it. She was fitted for a gown she would never remember seeing. She chose flowers she did not care about. She signed documents in a hand that looked like hers, but felt like a stranger's. She felt nothing. The world had gone gray and flat, and she moved through it like a ghost, going through the motions of living without actually being alive. 3 weeks before the wedding, a man arrived at the gates. He was alone, on foot, dressed in rags that might once have been clothes. His face was scarred, marked by sun and wind and violence. His hair was long and matted, his beard unkempt. His eyes were hollow, haunted by things he had seen and could not forget. The guards did not recognize him, but when he spoke, his voice was steady, familiar beneath the roughness. "I am Theron," he said, "Knight of the Crown. I have come home." They brought him to the great hall, more out of protocol than belief. The counselors gathered, staring at this scarecrow of a man who claimed to be someone they had buried in their minds months ago. He looked nothing like the knight who had left. He was thinner, broken in ways that had nothing to do with body. His hands were rough and calloused, his armor long since lost or sold. He carried a sword, but it was not his own, a cheap blade, poorly balanced, the kind a desperate man might steal from a corpse. But his eyes were the same, and his voice. "You were reported dead," one of the counselors said, his tone caught between suspicion and disbelief. "I was left for dead," Theron said. "I survived." "How?" "By will alone." They asked him questions. Where had he been? What had he seen? Why had he not sent word? He answered in short, clipped sentences, his voice flat, drained of emotion. He had been captured after the battle, held prisoner in a camp in the mountains. He had escaped during a raid, killed 2 guards with his bare hands, and fled into the wilderness. He had walked for weeks through enemy territory, sleeping in ditches, eating whatever he could find or steal. He had crossed rivers and mountains and forests, driven by a single thought, a single promise. He had come home. "And what do you want now?" the chief counselor asked, his eyes narrow. Theron looked at him. "To serve. You have no rank anymore, no title. The king who knighted you is dead. You are a deserter in the eyes of some, a ghost in the eyes of others." "Then I will serve as a ghost," the counselor frowned. "That is not how this works." "I do not care how it works," Theron said, and there was steel in his voice now, the first hint of the man he had been. "I came back. I am here. Use me or do not. But I have kept my oath." There was a long silence. Finally, the counselor waved his hand dismissively. "You may stay, but you will be assigned to the lower guard. No honors, no privileges, no position of trust." Theron nodded. "As you wish." He turned to leave. "One more thing," the counselor said, and there was something sharp in his tone now, something almost cruel. "The princess is to be married in 3 weeks to Lord Garrett of the Western Marches. You will not speak to her. You will not approach her. You will not interfere. Is that understood?" Theron went very still. For a long moment he said nothing. Then quietly, "Understood," and he walked out, his footsteps echoing in the empty hall. Illyra heard the news from a servant girl who came to bring fresh linens. She was standing by the window, staring out at nothing, her mind 1,000 miles away, when the girl bustled in, her face flushed with excitement. "My lady, did you hear? One of the soldiers came back. They thought he was dead, but he came back." Illyra turned slowly. "Who?" "Theron, my lady, the knight who used to guard you. They say he walked all the way from the northern territories. They say he killed men with his bare hands to escape." The world tilted. "He is here?" Illyra whispered. "Yes, my lady. They've assigned him to the lower guard, down by the eastern gate." Illyra did not wait. She did not think. She ran. She found him in the courtyard, standing by the well, washing the grime from his face and hands. He looked up when he heard her footsteps, and their eyes met, and time stopped. For a moment, neither of them moved, both frozen by disbelief and hope and the sheer impossibility of this moment. Then she crossed the space between them, and before he could speak, before he could think, she threw her arms around him and held him as if the world were ending, as if he might disappear if she let go. He stood rigid, his hands hovering at his sides, afraid to touch her, afraid this was a dream he would wake from. "My lady." "You came back," she said, her voice breaking. "You came back." "I promised I would." She pulled away just enough to look at him, her hands on his shoulders, her eyes searching his face, cataloging every new scar, every change, every mark the war had left on him. "I thought you were dead," she said. "They told me you were dead. I mourned you." "I am not dead." "I mourned you," she said again, and tears were streaming down her face now. "I mourned you. I am sorry." She laughed, a sound halfway between joy and grief, broken and beautiful. "Do not apologize for living." He looked at her, and his expression was so full of pain and longing that it hurt to see. "I cannot stay near you," he said quietly. "They have forbidden it." "I do not care what they have forbidden." "You are to be married." "I know." "Then there is nothing I can do. There is nothing either of us can do." She held his gaze, her hands still on his shoulders, refusing to let go. "There is one thing," she said. "What?" "You can tell me the truth," she said. "You can tell me what you feel, just once, so I know I did not imagine it." He closed his eyes, and she saw the war inside him, the battle between duty and desire, between what he had been taught and what he felt. "My lady." "Please," she whispered. "I need to hear it, even if only once." He opened his eyes and looked at her, and when he spoke, his voice was raw, stripped of everything but truth. "I have loved you since the day I first stood outside your door," he said. "I have loved you in silence, without hope, without asking for anything in return. I have loved you through war and death and distance. I carried the thought of you through darkness and pain and despair, and it was the only thing that kept me alive. I will love you until I die. That is the truth." She was crying now, tears streaming down her face, all the grief and loneliness and love she had been holding back finally finding release. "I love you too," she said. "I have always loved you. From the first moment, even though I did not know it then, I love you." He reached up and gently wiped the tears from her cheeks, his touch impossibly soft. "Then we will carry this," he said, "and it will be enough." "Will it?" "It will have to be." She closed her eyes and leaned into his touch, and for one perfect, fragile moment, they were not a princess and a knight, not subjects of duty and obligation. They were just two people who had found each other in the dark. The wedding was called off. Elira went to the council herself the next morning and told them she would not marry Lord Garrett. They argued, they shouted, they reminded her of her duty, her obligation, the needs of the realm. She listened to all of it with a calm that surprised even herself. And then she said, "No. You cannot refuse," the chief counselor said, his face red with anger. "I can, and I do. The kingdom needs this alliance. Then find another way." "There is no other way. Your sister is queen now, but she cannot." "Then the kingdom will survive without it," Elira said, "as it always has." The counselor stared at her, fury and disbelief warring in his expression. "You are being selfish. You are putting your own desires above the good of the realm." "Yes," she said simply. "For the first time in my life, I am choosing myself, and I will live with the consequences." She turned and walked out, leaving them stunned and silent behind her. They stripped Theron of his position in the lower guard. They told him he was no longer welcome in the castle, that his presence was a disruption, that he must leave. He did not argue. He took what little he had, a pack, a sword, a few coins, and left. Elira found him on the road outside the castle, walking toward the forest, his back straight despite everything. "Where are you going?" she called. He stopped and turned. "Away," he said. "It is better this way." "For whom?" "For you." She walked toward him, her cloak billowing in the wind, her face set with determination. "I do not want you to go," she said. "I know." "Then stay." "I cannot. They will not allow it. Your life here." "I do not want my life here," she said fiercely. "I want to be free." He looked at her, and something shifted in his face. Something like hope, fragile and dangerous. "What are you saying?" he asked carefully. She reached for his hand and took it in hers, their fingers interlacing as if they had always belonged that way. "I am saying, come with me," she said. "We will leave this place. We will find somewhere quiet, somewhere no one knows us, somewhere we can live as we choose." "They will call you a traitor. They will say you abandoned your duty." "Let them. You will lose everything, your title, your wealth, your family." "I have already lost everything that mattered," she said, her eyes locked on his. "Except you." He stared at her and then slowly, wonderfully, he smiled. It was the first time she had ever seen him smile. "Are you certain?" he asked. "Yes. There is no going back." "I know." He squeezed her hand, his grip warm and strong. "Then let us go." They traveled for weeks, moving through forests and over hills, following roads and rivers and the slow pull of instinct. They avoided the main routes, stayed away from large towns, moved quietly through a world that had forgotten them as quickly as it had shaped them. They spoke little at first, still adjusting to this new freedom, this new life. But the silence between them was warm now, companionable, full of understanding and promise. At night, they made camp under the stars, sharing bread and dried meat, listening to the sounds of the forest around them. He told her stories of his childhood, of the lower city, of the priest who had taught him to read. She told him about her mother, about the tower, about all the years of loneliness she had thought were simply her fate. They learned each other slowly, carefully, with the patience of people who finally had time. They reached a village on the edge of the kingdom, so small it had no name and appeared on no maps. It sat in a valley, surrounded by fields and woods, and the people there were kind and did not ask questions about the woman and the scarred soldier who arrived one autumn day looking for work and shelter. They found a small house on the outskirts, abandoned years ago when its owner died without heirs. It was run down but sturdy, with stone walls and a sound roof and a garden gone wild with weeds. They repaired it together, working side by side in the fading light of autumn. He fixed the roof, replaced rotted boards, reinforced the door. She cleaned the floors, scrubbed the walls, planted herbs and vegetables in the garden. They made it theirs. They lived simply, the way people had lived for thousands of years before castles and crowns and the complicated machinery of kingdoms. He worked in the fields, hiring himself out to farmers during planting and harvest. She tended the house, the garden, baked bread, sold herbs in the village market, and at night they sat by the fire, and he read to her from the few books they had brought, his voice low and steady, and she rested her head on his shoulder, and they were content. Years passed. The kingdom forgot them, as kingdoms do. There were new wars, new alliances, new crises that demanded attention. The world moved on. Elira's sister ruled as queen, and from what they heard in the occasional bits of news that reached the village, she ruled well. The realm stabilized, trade resumed, life continued. And in the small house in the valley, two people who had once been a princess and a knight grew old together, quietly, without ceremony or audience. They never regretted their choice, not when winter came hard and they shivered through long nights, not when crops failed and hunger gnawed, not when sickness came to the village and they nursed each other through fever and pain. They had chosen this life, and it was enough, more than enough. They had each other. One night, deep in winter, when the snow lay thick on the ground and the stars were bright overhead, Elira woke to find Theron sitting by the window, looking out at the frozen world. The house was quiet. The fire had burned down to embers. Outside, the world was still and perfect and white. "What are you thinking?" she asked softly, pulling the blanket around her shoulders. He turned to her, and his face was gentle in the dim light, lined with age but still familiar, still beloved. "I was thinking," he said, "that I have lived a good life." She rose and went to him, and he pulled her into his arms, and she fit there perfectly, the way she always had. "So have I," she said. They stood there, wrapped in each other, listening to the silence. Outside, the world was vast and cold and indifferent. Inside, the embers glowed, the walls held warmth, and two people who had given up everything to have this moment stood together and felt no regret. "Do you remember," she said after a while, "the first time we spoke? In the chapel, during the rain. You were so serious, so formal." "I was terrified," he admitted. "You were a princess. I was nothing." "You were never nothing." He kissed the top of her head. "I know that now." "What changed?" "You," he said simply. "You changed everything." She smiled against his chest. "We changed each other." "Yes." They stood in silence, watching the snow fall outside, watching the world turn slowly toward morning. And somewhere in the distance, a bell rang, soft and clear, marking the passage of time, the turning of the years, the quiet inevitability of all things. But here, in this small house, in this small moment, there was only warmth, only peace, only love. The fire shifted in the hearth, sending up a small shower of sparks. Theron reached over and added another log, and the flames rose gratefully, casting dancing shadows on the walls. "We should sleep," she said. "We should," he agreed, but neither of them moved. They stood there a little longer, holding each other, memorizing this moment, this feeling, this quiet joy that needed no words. Finally, she took his hand and led him back to bed, and they lay down together, her head on his chest, his arm around her, and listened to each other breathe. The snow continued to fall. The night continued its slow journey toward dawn. And in the house at the edge of the village, two people who had loved each other through war and loss and time itself finally surrendered to sleep, peaceful and unafraid, knowing that whatever came next, they would face it together. And that was enough. Thank you for spending this time with me here in the Sleep Wizards Library. If your eyes have grown heavy, let them close. If you're already drifting, allow the story to fade like a candle at dawn, wishing you a peaceful rest, gentle dreams, and a night free from worry. Sleep well, and I'll see you again soon.